you would like to get a copy of one of those documents or all four, please write your name and I'll send it to you afterward. Okay, and the last thing, of course, is given the audio in this room, if anybody can't hear, I'm using this mic now, but he's going to use the lavalier mic, so let's hope that works as well. If anyone can't hear, you got to raise your hand and say, because otherwise we can't know that.
What if there's a fire?
What?
Fire.
Fire. Fire.
Oh, fire. You know all about fire. You know all that. Okay, so if something happens, everybody say, you know this.
Cell phones.
Thank you. Cell phones. Well done, Kappa. I am so glad to introduce my friend Gerie. Gerie Bledsoe has a PhD in 20th century European history and political theory from Florida State University. He taught at Randolph-Macon College in Virginia before working for the American Association of University Professors and the National Education Association in Washington, D.C. After leaving D.C., he was appointed assistant provost for university outreach at Michigan State University, finally retiring from the California Teachers Association. After moving to Mexico, which is where I met him, Gerie taught the first course in 2012, and he wrote this, of course. He taught the first course in 2012 for Joe Sanders' new lifelong learning program in San Miguel de Allende. And he taught at least one course on Mexican history there every year thereafter for the next 12 years. He has recently begun teaching in retirement communities, including the talk on Hitler that he will deliver today at Woodland Pond. I'm so pleased to introduce to you my friend and my teacher, Gerie Bledsoe.
Thank you, Joe. And if anybody can't hear me, please raise your hand, okay? I was teaching down in Mexico in February, and my mic went out. So I had to hold it to my lips. And it became an hour and a half, it became sort of a problem. On January the 30th, 1933, at 11:30 in the morning, President Hindenburg of the German Republic swore in Adolf Hitler as the Chancellor of Germany. January 30th, 1933. The question that's asked and debated by historians is, well, first, to explain what happened is not to forgive what happened. It is to do it as objectively as possible, which I will do in this, because I'm an academic and I do believe in being objective about things. Louder?
Yeah.
Y'all have to say.
You can, thank you.
Does that help?
So the question before you is, was Hitler's rise to power, become chancellor, inevitable? And that question has been answered by a variety of historians different ways.
I don't think so.
No.
Put one on.
Just one.
One of the historians that wrote
What am I gonna do?
in the early 1950s was an American journalist in Berlin, and he came to the conclusion it was inevitable. He was there, Hitler took over. But historians later on, in the 21st century, say, no, not really. But I will try to explain it as objectively as possible, and you can make that decision. We can discuss it if we have time at the end of this. This is what Europe looked like 1914 when the First World War started. The German Empire, 2/3 of it was this kingdom of Prussia. 2/3 of the German Empire was Prussia, and that had a big effect on Germany, a big effect. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was also huge, but When the war started in 1914, they had a lot of internal problems in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Nationalism was taking over in some of those countries like Hungary and Serbia, places like that. But just did, and the Russian Empire was huge, but it had a lot of problems. World War I took a drastic toll on Germany. 2 million men were killed. 2 million. 3 million were wounded. Of those 3 million wounded, 800,000 required assistance, continuing assistance. 280,000 widows needed to be supported by the government. In addition to that, the country was bankrupt. They'd been issuing war bonds to pay for the war, and it was all over. 1918. They were bankrupt and did not know how they were going to deal with their debt, but it'll get worse. Civilians during this World War in Germany, between 350 and 470,000 of them died by disease, Spanish flu, by starvation, by other problems, but it was a huge loss of population during this time. So my point is that Germany was in really bad shape in 1918 after the war. And of course, 1918, Germany surrenders, what the? The German people had been told in October, they're winning the war. The Kaiser told them in August, we're winning the war. Of course, the Kaiser didn't tell them that Austria wants to surrender, that Bulgaria wants to surrender. And then the generals, I don't think the German generals told the Kaiser, we don't think we can win it. That's in August and September. In October, a German general by the name of Ludendorff, who was really commander of the army, was trying to negotiate with truce with Woodrow Wilson. But on September the 8th, basically, Germany surrendered. They signed the armistice on the 11th of November. But that would be turned into a myth by the German generals. Ludendorff and Hindenburg's on the left, were heroes in Germany. And they decided we should surrender, turn it over to the civilian government so they could blame for it. Now, there were people in the German government thought they'd get better terms if the empire was, the monarch left, Kaiser left, which he did. So they started a story that, no, the German army was never defeated. We were stabbed in the back by the socialists and by the Jews and by the communists. And that became a fundamental part of Hitler's belief in ideology, the stab in the back. People could not believe that the German Empire had been defeated. In March, Russia surrendered to the German government. In March of 1918. And how could you go from defeating Russia to surrendering in November? The Front generation, this is another myth that was very powerful in Germany after World War I, that these men who fought hand-to-hand combat were a new generation that had a different approach to things, who were waiting to take over, solve whatever problem Germany came down with. The myth of the Front generation, a new generation, we would call it the Band of Brothers. Ever seen the movie? The Band of Brothers. Combat people who get so close, they're working, they're protecting each other, they bond forever, so many of them. And when the Kaiser left Germany and Holland, and the government collapsed, it started a revolution all across Germany. Primarily, there were radical socialists who became communists. There were anarchists. There were others who wanted to get away with to do away with the empire and have a democracy. but it got really, really bad. I mean, it was chaos. So the Social Democrats, who were the biggest party in the legislature, even before the war, wanted to have a democracy, but they had to get the crazies under control. So they worked and they worked and they worked, and it got so bad that in January of 1919, there was a communist revolution in Berlin. And the provisional government had to call in the Free Corps veterans who working together as a private army, and also the army to suppress the communist revolution in Berlin. And the violence really started because the people that came in to suppress the communists summarily murdered the leaders of the communist revolution. They shot them on the floor. So the communist revolution, I don't know what happened to him on that, but anyway, it's a revolution. That was in January, and later on, the socialists, social democrats, are able to call a convention in the city of Weimar, where a constitution was written for a republic. The constitution was a rewrite of the previous constitution of the empire. So it was democratic, and it gave women the right to vote. All people, 20 years, it used to be all men could vote in the German Empire. They had to be 25 years old. They lowered that to 20, and they allowed women to vote. So the Weimar Constitution was passed, and Weimar government came into being in the late summer of 2019. But by 1920, a bunch of soldiers marched into Berlin and tried to throw the Weimar Republic out, called a cat push. That's the word for coup in German. My German's not very good, but I say French and Spanish, but push sounds so funny. The cat push was prevented. There was also one in the Ruhr. There was also one in Bavaria, Hamburg. It was chaotic. And then the Germans had to sign the Treaty of Versailles in June of 1918. I don't know this for a fact, but when Germany defeated France in 1871, they had a party and they signed a treaty in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. So this must have been like retribution. Reparations, all European governments that went to war and won the war expected to be paid reparations by the country they defeated. Wilson wanted modest reparations and modest territorial loss. He didn't want to create the grounds for another war by Germany. But he gave in to the French and the British and said, look, these Germans were really bad, especially in Belgium. Well, they stole everything. Trains, trucks, people, women, we got to pay the people back in Belgium. And in France, northern France was destroyed by trench warfare. Reparations were huge. And the Weimar government looked at it and said, we're already in debt. How are we going to do it? And they didn't pay the first round of reparations, so the French sent an army into the Ruhr to take over its coal mining industry. It's retribution. So it was bad. Territory, I'll show a slide eventually of what they lost. But they lost about 17% of their territory and about 13% of the population. Pieces went to Poland, pieces went to Czechoslovakia, pieces went to France, Belgium got some, all the way around. But it was humiliation for the Germans to give up that territory that they had fought for and won for centuries. There's a lost territory. I don't have a thing, but you can see. This is Alsace-Lorraine, part of Belgium. The German Empire is brown and green down there. That dark green of Bavaria. The biggest loss was this area. It's Silesia, but it goes all the way up to the Danzig, and Danzig was turned into a free city. It was a German port, turned into a free city under the auspices of the League of Nations. So that was a huge loss. violated the concept of pan-Germanism, that is all Germans should be living, German-speaking people should be living in Germany, not even Austria, and certainly not in Poland, or Belgium, or Switzerland. Okay, these are the problems. Reparations, I mentioned that. The loss of much of Silesia, and there was after World War I, there was a battle going on between civilian armies in Silesia, Polish on one side, German Free Corps on the other side. Open warfare up there until the League of Nations got the border straightened out. Allied occupation, the Allies occupied the Rhineland until 1929. Hyperinflation. As soon as Germany lost the war, maybe even before, inflation had started in Germany. The value of the mark was slowly descending. 1921, 1922, it went to the bottom. It was so bad, there was a joke about a guy being paid in a wheelbarrow full of marks, going down the sidewalk, and he stops to go into a store to buy something, and when he comes out, someone's stolen the wheelbarrow, but not the money, because it's worthless. 144,000 marks for $1, something like that. And then the coups. There was numerous uprisings in Germany, even after the November Revolution. There were at least 8, starting with Kampfputsch and ending with Hitler's attempt to take over Bavaria. There were 8 serious ones. 8 serious coups. But it was for these years, 1919 until 1924, Weimar was in a lot of trouble. They sort of got it settled in 1924 and had 5 prosperous years, but the first part of it was horrible. I guess I'm going here.
I do not know. Try the up and down arrows and see whether that does anything. I have not a clue. Oh, you do know.
I don't know.
You do.
I don't know.
Because that's the whole slide. Try it now.
Huh?
This one. Good, thank you.
I'm so glad you're here.
In November 1923, this group of people tried to take over the Bavarian government. They were in Munich, and they tried to take over the government. The plan was to march on Berlin, like Mussolini and his fascisti marched on Rome in 1922. Hitler was a big fan of Mussolini. Mussolini had the black shirts, Hitler had the brown shirts. Mussolini didn't march on the capital, Hitler wanted to do the same. Unfortunately, it didn't work out well. The coup only lasted 24 hours. But what is remarkable, that's where they started at the beer hall. What is remarkable, if you can see this, everybody up there has a sword. They're going for trial. A sword is an indication that you're an officer. And you can see the medals on it. I mean, those are generals. One was Ludendorff. But you see one guy up there doesn't have. He's between 2 uniforms in civilian wear. He doesn't have the sword. People were going, who's that? It's Adolf Hitler. The German corporal, who is at this point still in Austria. He was there with all these. He went to prison. He was sentenced to prison for 5 years. He went to prison in April of 2014, but he was pardoned, he was paroled by the conservative Supreme Court of Bavaria. And he was, you're not supposed to get in politics, stay out of politics, but you could go out. So when people were asking, who is this guy? I mean, people know other parts of Germany were asking, who is this guy?
Huh?
Young Adolf Schnickelgruber. Know that story?
No.
Hitler's father was illegitimate. And his mother's name was Schickelgruber. And this is sort of a joke, but when we were talking about this in graduate school, someone said, could he ever be elected as chancellor with a name like Schnickelgruber? But his father took her mother's grandfather's name, which was like Hitler, translates it to Hitler, a little bit different also. We don't know much about his early life, but there's a theory that has been advanced that he was probably abused by his father. His father was an Austrian customs agent. They moved a lot, but again, we don't know for sure. But he had a very close relationship with his mother, but not with his father. He was going to high school in Linz, in Austria, which was the center of one of the pan-German and anti-Semitic movements at that time. Now, we don't know much about his interaction with those movements, but we do know that he left high school early. He said, I'm going to Vienna, I want to be an artist. He applied to go to the Austrian School of Art, and they turned him down. Probably because he wasn't a high school graduate. He lived on the streets and in flop houses, trying to sell his art. He painted postcards of buildings. But in Vienna, he was exposed to another anti-Semite, and that was the mayor of Vienna, who was one of the populists, first populists, who gave these speeches, and of course, also the Social Democrats were also radical, trying to radicalize people. So it was it could have been, we don't know for sure, that much about what was inculcated in him as a young man in Vienna at this time. His mother died in 2007, and he praised the Jewish doctor that took care of him. After his mother died, he moved to Munich. That's in 1913. And when the war started, he volunteered immediately for the German army, the Bavarian regiment of the German army, and they accepted him. Even though he was an Austrian, even though they should not have done that. It's a violation of their treaty agreements and things like that, but you know. So in Munich, he became, I'll go through this, in Munich he was a message runner, carried messages at the front, very dangerous job. He was wounded twice, gassed once, cluster gas, and he got the Iron Cross, second class, which is not that unusual, but he also got the Iron Cross, the top Medal of Honor of Germans, which is very rarely given to an enlisted man. He was a corporal. Well, it just so happened that his commanding officer was Jewish. All these things to ponder on, you know. Ironies, I guess you'd call them. So, in 1918, he's in a hospital. Adolf Hitler is in a hospital recovering from a mustard gas attack. And in his writings, he said, I was just getting better, I could see a little bit, and then I heard that Germany surrendered, and I got blind again. But he was eventually released from the hospital, and he decided not to get out of the army, but to go back to Munich. To Munich in 1919. And we don't know exactly what happened, but the German army was indoctrinating their people who were leaving the army. They had to go to a lecture. And he became an army lecturer, which surprised a lot of people. What's going on there? He became well known as a lecturer, and his officers decided, well, you're going to go out, we want you to go out and observe what's going on with some of these organizations being formed, political organizations being formed in Munich after the war. So he went to the German Workers' Party. Just started up. He was funded by a secret society called the Thule Society, and the leader of it was mildly anti-Semitic and pro-German and all stuff. But Hitler, eventually, in 1920, they sit down and they write the 25-point program of the German Workers' Party, which had become the Nationalist German Workers' Party. National Socialism. Socialism was added to their title because they wanted to attract industrial workers. Didn't work. The Social Democrats had a very good relationship with the trade unions, and almost all the industrial workers were Social Democrats. 1921, he becomes the leader, the undisputed leader of the National Socialists, the Nazis, and he demands that people refer to him as the Fuhrer, the leader.
The book that he wrote, is that Mein Kampf?
Mein Kampf.
Okay.
He wrote Mein Kampf when he was in prison. It was published in 1925. Didn't sell much.
Okay, I have one more question.
But Mein Kampf means my struggle.
Can we hold the questions until later, because otherwise he'll have a hard time finishing?
Okay, I just want to go back to his birth.
His birth.
I had heard that his mother was Jewish.
That had been, most historians do not believe that. Or that he had any, no one has proved he had any Jewish ancestry. The rumor was that a grandfather had been. That his mother's grandfather, one of his mother's grandfathers had been Jewish.
Time check, 4:30.
Yep. So National Socialists, if you look at the initials, National Socialist, German, Deutsche, Worker Party, if you say it in German as a word, acronym, it sounds like Nazi. So that's where Nazis came from, and the opponents, the Hitler and his guys never referred to themselves as Nazis. They were National Socialists. That was it. And it was the opponents, they called them Nazis. The swastika, you know, Arizona in the 1930s had road signs that had swastikas on them. Arizona. This is an ancient symbol. And the Indians in Arizona thought it meant good luck. But it was picked up by the anti-Semitic, pro-German guys in the Free Corps, these private armies that marched around, and they did it different ways. And it goes out of the first Nazi flag was put on someone's castle in Austria in 2007.
1970.
Yeah, he needs 19.
So between 1924, when he was not supposed to participate in politics, he focused on Hitler focused on reorganizing the Workers' Party and also creating what became the brown shirts. Before that, they just protected him with making speeches. But he really turned it into a private army like Mussolini did. He created a culture around himself where he would not tolerate anyone questioning what he was saying. No one. And he converted people just by insisting with his gut that he was right. No, you're wrong. Don't tell me that anymore. If you do, get out. And some of the people, like his propaganda chief, Joseph Goebbels, had different ideas. And Hitler would not tolerate any contrary discussion. But he also fomented conflict among his lieutenants because they would come in and talk to him, well, I think this, you ought to do this, and others would say that he would choose the one he wanted. They would never meet as a staff and say, we think you ought to do this. He didn't like that. Recruits, they started building a party that was significant, but the party every party member had to swear allegiance to the Fuhrer, Hitler. Eventually, everyone in Germany would have to do that, but it started with the recruits, and there was a lot of, because of all the problems in Germany, there were a lot of people who turned to Hitler early on, but not that many joined the party. Only about 75% 75,000 in a nation of millions, 60-some odd million. In the elections they finally are able to start campaigning locally in 1926. They're doing pretty well in local elections, especially in Prussia. But in the national election, 1928, they only get 2.6% of the vote. And like I said, they only had 75,000 members. When the National Socialists had hundreds of thousands, maybe a million or two members. So what did Hitler need? What did the Nazis need? Get things going for them. Oh, September 1929, the Great Depression starts. And in just a few months, Germany's economy was already going down as early as 1928, 1929, but not seriously, but this really did. Benefits. The German government in 1931 started reducing unemployment benefits because they didn't have enough taxes to come in. That's called deflation. They lowered prices so low that factories could not sell their products or make their products and make a profit off it, so they closed down. Same thing happened in the United States, 1931. Crime went up. Violence between the gangs in the streets, between the brown shirts and the communists, and guys, primarily guys out of work, who had to steal to feed their families. Notice chaotic time. Eventually, there was 6 million Germans out of work, plus there are 13 million dependents they had to support. And they became members of the Communist Party. So the Communist Party, which was growing at this time, became the party of the unemployed. Hitler's party became the party of protest, according to Richard Evans. And here he starts. 1930 election, Nazis jumped from 12 to 102 seats in the Reichstag. Now the Reichstag did not have a permanent ceiling. Depending on how many people got elected, we got 60,000 votes. So this would probably be, if I remember, about 441 delegates at that time. So they only had 12 to begin with, but they jumped up to 2008. Look at the communists, they jump up to 77. So you have two radical parties who do not believe in democracy, building their strength in the Reichstag. They weren't the only ones. 12 parties. There were at least, at one time, 32 political parties in Germany. Germany is made up of 16 or 17 different states, and I don't know, different people wanted to do their own thing. Because when you have 12 parties, some of them only had 1 or 2 delegates in the Reichstag. It was hard to form a coalition. Impossible. Social Democrats tried, but were not able to get a majority in the Reichstag in the legislature. So they formed coalition governments, and for most of the Weimar years, it was all coalition governments, a 3-party state party. The parties that were being elected, not only the communists and the Nazis, but also the German People's Party, were opposed to democracy. They said openly, we're going to do away with it. The German People's Party was a monarchist. Paul Hindenburg, president, who was elected in 1925, was a monarchist. They did not accept the Weimar Republic. In fact, it's quite possible that a majority of Germans did not really support and believe that the Weimar government, their democracy, was legitimate. They think that Hitler said it was forced on us by the Allies. We never really agreed to it. The German people didn't agree to it. So let's get rid of it. Hitler said, democracy divides us. And certainly it did. I mean, the Germans, when the communists got into the Reichstag and the Nazis got removed, they had a fist fight in the floor of the Reichstag and in the halls of the Reichstag. Democracy is hard to, staying with that going on, well, this is, I shortened this up a bit. But from 1930, there were 1932 presidential chancellors. Now, under the Weimar Constitution, the president could call elections anytime he wanted to, or she wanted to, could appoint a chancellor anyone he wanted to, someone not even in the Reichstag, regardless of what they said. And he could rule by emergency decree, rule by giving the chancellor a decree, presidential decree that he signed that they could do something big. That was the end of democracy. The Weimar government simply stopped working. And the last two presidential chancellors were friends and supporters and advisors of Paul Hindenburg, the president. And it was called the presidential dictatorship. Historians have called it that, they would call it at that time. During this period, 24 laws were passed by the Reichstag, 24, on virtually not very important subject. There were 102 presidential decrees, 102. They ruled by decree. And that is old German. That's what the Kaiser did. So the president of the Weimar Republic really replaced the Kaiser, in a sense. Street violence was the brown shirts, the Nazis versus the socialists versus the communists. These are the number of deaths that were recorded in these years. It got so bad in 1932, 155 deaths were recorded. Now this, these are deaths, this is what was found in the archives. It could have been 355 for all we know. But it was battling in the streets. And there were at least 10,000 people that were admitted to hospitals because of the violence in the street. This worried the German middle class as well as the aristocracy. The German middle class had a reputation of being well educated, having their stuff together, being smart, articulate. And it's believed that they actually voted for Hitler in 1932, we'll get to that, because they thought he would stop the violence. Wrong. 3 elections, this is sort of got complicated, so I'll go through it and then we'll come back to it if you have questions. There was a presidential election. The presidential term in Germany was 7 years. Hindenburg was elected 1925. He's running again. He didn't want to run, but the aristocrats said, "Oh, you got to. You got to keep these radicals out, the communists." And so he agreed to run again. I think he was 82 years old. Oh, that sounds familiar. Some people just don't know when to retire, right? So in the Reichstag, the Nazis jumped from 102 seats to 230. They become the largest party in the Reichstag. Now, Reichstag at this time had almost 600 members, but they're nowhere near a majority. But it was a big boom in German politics when Adolf Hitler becomes the leader of the largest party in the Reichstag, the legislature. Well, first, Hitler ran against Hindenburg in the election and only got, in a runoff, got 37% of the vote. Hindenburg got 53%, so he was reelected. Then that was in the spring, and then in the summer they had the Reichstag election. That's where he really jumped up. Hitler demands, "I demand to be chancellor. I have the largest party." And Hitler said, "Nein, Dummkopf." No. Hindenburg did not like the fact that an Austrian was messing around in his politics. Hitler demanded during 1930, demanded twice to be, the first time he met with Hindenburg, and the second time it's sort of a meeting, but Hindenburg sort of walked away from him. And it was a time of serious problems, and Hindenburg, who needs a chancellor, turns to a general by the name of Schleicher to be the chancellor, and he's a German general, didn't have a lot of interest in politics, and he wanted to do things like land reform. So he lasted 2 months, less than 2 months. But during this time, a guy by the name of Franz von Papen was one of the presidential chancellors. And he was a really close friend of Hindenburg. And he met secretly in January with Hitler. Hitler's position was he would not accept a role as in a coalition cabinet. Von Papen said, look, Adolf, Corporal, we will make you chancellor. I will be Papen, vice chancellor. They negotiated, and Hitler got 2 more appointments to the cabinet of 10. The rest of them were aristocrats, like the foreign minister, things like that. So Papen goes to president and says, Hindenburg said, I got a deal for you. And explained it. And Hindenburg, I don't think, was real happy about it, but according to the historians who wrote about this, he agreed. He agreed. And it said at 11:30, January the 30th, the Reichstag building, he was appointed chancellor. I missed this, sorry. In 1932, a very significant event took place. I took a slide out before this. And that was with an emergency decree from the president, Franz von Papen took over the entire state of Prussia. He claimed that the communists were getting too much influence and that the government, which was a social democratic government, was not doing enough. So, President, we got to stop that. So the president signed the decree. This made it ultimately very easy. It paved the way for Adolf Hitler and Nazis to take over. Again, 2/3 of they took over the police, they took over the courts, they took over the military. It was a coup that got worse. But something happened in the November elections there. The Nazis fall off. And, there's a fair amount of electoral data available, and has been made available to historians. The one that I know most is Richard Evans, and he thinks it's because of the middle class who were voting for him as the party of protest stopped voting for him and started going back to their traditional, moderate parties, center parties. The communists up to 100, and the impact. Hitler's party was bankrupt. This is November. And his warriors are saying, have a coup, we want a coup. Come on, let's go throw Hindenburg out. And Hitler said, no, we're not gonna do that. He starts negotiating, and that's when he negotiates a deal with Papen. So that's Papen's deal. Hitler put the asterisk by the Nazis. Of course, Hitler was Chancellor. Gerie, one of the more corrupt of the Nazis, former ace during World War I, he gets Prussia. He gets total control of Prussia. And Frick, who's a Nazi, a lawyer, gets control of all of the courts and the police outside of Prussia. Of course, the other non-Nazi there was Hugenberg, and he was the leader of the German People's Party, which was a monarchist, anti-democratic party. And he agreed under a lot of pressure. When I started working on this in 1924, a book came out that details everything happened every hour in January with this negotiations. How did they do that? I don't know, but it's remarkable. This is very, very convenient for me. It's all written down there. So Hugenberg didn't really want to be with Hitler, although he had worked with him before, politically. But as chancellor But he did it anyway, and he told somebody later on, worst decision I ever made in my life. So, this picture is not on that date, but this picture was propaganda to show that Hitler was bowing to tradition and the aristocracy. The aristocrats thought they could control him. No way, Jose. So he becomes chancellor in Germany. 2 days after chancellor, he goes to the army and says, you don't have to worry about us taking you over. You're going to be independent. We're not going to involve you in politics. And I want territory. And we're going to remilitarize and all that. That was 2 days after. He talked to the people, generals before, but that was the one where he really promised as chancellor. With the brown shirts, as soon as the word is out that Hitler is chancellor, the brown shirts are marching around Berlin, trashing, going after socialists, after the communists, and after Jews. It's just wild. And eventually, Hitler's convinced to calm him down, which he does. So he promised the aristocrats, he said, I believe in private property. We're not going to mess with your private property. You got land, even if you're not using it. The German government, he made this long thing about he really believed that private property was so important. That's a liberal idea. Okay. The army, talk about the industrialists, he met with them more than once. He told them the same thing. He believed in private property. He's not going to do anything, but he's going to rearm. And the industrialists will help rearm. They'll make a lot of money. The country will get back. And it happened. That part he delivered on. Of course, he bankrupted the government in the process, but he did get people back to work. And he started in 1935 rearming Germany. And the Allies didn't do much about it. Late February, all of a sudden, the Reichstag building burns down. People are going, holy moly, what happened there? Hitler and his propaganda machine say, if the communists did it, there's going to be a revolution. We got to do something about it. So Hindenburg signs an executive decree giving Hitler the right to suspend civil rights and take over the government of any state he feels is not doing enough to suppress communism. That was not the beginning, but the next big step in creating a dictatorship. But in the March elections, now they trashed the Communist Party. I've seen anywhere from rounding up 8,000 communists to 10,000, putting them in the first concentration camps, Dachau, the first one, that led to a series of concentration camps all the way, but they were all considered Dachau. Shame. They had local names, but even after trashing that and the socialists, they attacked the socialists, democratic socialists. They also attacked the unions. They only got, and they arrested communist Reichstag deputies and put them in prison. In the March election, they only got 43%. So the bottom line here is, unlike I thought at one time in my life, Hitler was never elected by the German people. He never won election as president, and his party never got a majority until they had a total dictatorship, until they eliminated all the political parties in 1935, 1936. The next thing that happens is the Enabling Act. That was in March. Hitler made a deal with the German People's Party and the Catholic Center Party to create basically a dictatorship. The Enabling Act allowed Hitler and his cabinet, really Hitler, to make any law, regardless of the Constitution, I got a 2/3 vote to Reichstag, regardless of the Constitution, Weimar Constitution, regardless of any existing law, Hitler's word became law. It was a German term for it that I can't pronounce. His word, anything he said, you do this, you do that, you don't do that, that was it. And if you didn't follow it, you were in concentration camp. If your neighbor ratted you out, you're in a concentration camp. Now, concentration camps were not extermination places, they were primarily work camps, but they were pretty bad conditions. So the Enabling Act was really a big step. And in April the 1st, it wasn't a joke. They had the Nazis had a national boycott of Jewish stores, except for the big department stores. They thought if he thought it'd be bad for the economy to close it down. They put a stormtrooper out in front of all the little Jewish stores and tell people don't go to the store. They purged, they passed a law that eliminated all Jews from the civil service, from the army, and from some professions. Then in May, they had a national book burning all across Germany, where the brown shirts would come into the libraries, throw all the books out of the street or out of the yard and burn them. The Nazi youth, the Nazi college students, university students participated in that, so it's not just the brown shirts. The labor unions were eliminated. A government agency, a Nazi agency, took over all the workers. They no longer have unions and they no longer go on strike. They developed sort of a system of binding arbitration. Civic troops, like Germany had a women's organization, a couple million, shut down. But the anti-Semitism grew. Even sports clubs would not accept Jews as members. And even Jewish boxers who were doing pretty well, no more, you can't box anymore, professionally. Final steps in creating a dictatorship, and this is not really, it could have been avoided probably. The Night of the Long Knives, Gestapo, and is sent out to kill any enemy that Hitler thinks he has. They even killed the former chancellor. They even killed the former head of the brown shirts. They even killed Hitler's priest. The number of people ranged is anywhere from 300 to 1,000 died in the 3-day periods. But the main thing that Hitler was trying to do was to tell the aristocrats that he controlled, that Hitler controlled the brown shirts, that they didn't have to worry about the brown shirts anymore. Because that was probably the biggest group that he went after were the lieutenants in the brown shirts who had sort of quasi-socialist ideas. Oops. So that's July. And then the second step comes sort of easily for Hitler. August 2nd, I think, Hindenburg, 86 years old, passes away, natural causes. 2 days before, Hitler got a law passed that the office of Chancellor and President would be combined. And he was generous enough to say, well, I'll take both paychecks. It's true. So this really did it, but I had to throw in 1935, the Nuremberg laws were passed in September, which took German citizenship away from German Jews, the Romani, the Gypsies, and a few others, which meant that they were still entitled to welfare if they were on it, but they could not have civil rights in Germany. They could not vote. by special laws, and they could not be on the newspaper stands, things like that. So we're about to end up, but the problem was, and some people probably remember this, when the Germans lost their citizenship, the German Jews lost their citizenship, many countries would not accept them because they didn't have citizenship. You couldn't say, I'm here, I'm here as a German citizen. No, you're not a citizen anywhere. Actually, Hitler ran into that problem. He was trying to get German citizenship. Hitler's coming to power, according to Richard Evans, came in 2 steps. The first step was Papen's coup, taking over Prussia, taking over 2/3 of Germany right there. And then the second one was the Nationalist Revolution in 1933 to 1935. That was what Hitler called it. Hitler believed that all Germans should work for the benefit of Germany, not themselves. Forget about your personal ambitions. You do what I think is best for you to do for Germany. That was what he really believed. So those are the reasons: the Depression, communism, World War I, Weimar weakness, and the aristocrats thinking they can control. Those are the main reasons. Then there were more. The Nazi organization was tight. I mean, they were all over Germany, working the streets, printing newspapers, putting out flyers, talking to people, beating people up, disagreeing with them. And Hitler, there are people who wrote diaries, Germans, who went to speeches by Hitler and didn't like what he was saying, but walked away saying, oh God, he's an unbelievable speaker. He mesmerizes his crowds for 2 hours. And he starts off softly, and he ends up at a crescendo, shaking his fist, banging it. No. You can go on YouTube and see many of his speeches, video, that have been translated into English. I actually wanted to put one in here, but I couldn't figure out how to do it. I'm not a techie guy. But they all said that. One of the psychologists that studied, not Hitler, but his speech and all, said that what he was doing during the speeches, his post-traumatic stress syndrome, we used to call it shell shock, and other things that were coming out. No one ever talked about him really being crazy. But I watched some of those things. It's just amazing. Now, one theory was that he did it ad hoc, without, but usually he had a list of things that he was going to include. But he did what a lot of populists did. He identified his enemies. They are the Jews, they are the communists, they're the profit makers, they're the people who are unfit. He wanted to sterilize dead people. Not dead people. He thought that being dead was hereditary. And there were about 360,000 women sterilized. No, men and women sterilized because they had some disability. And in 1939, he told all the hospitals that were keeping people alive, turn it off. So, but the propaganda in his speeches was, got the myths, front generation stabbed in the back, the Iron Chancellor didn't do that one. Hitler believed that another myth, that an international Jewish banking conspiracy had funded the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And that became one of the great myths. So whenever he talked about communism, he would call it Jewish Bolshevism. Not Russian communism or Russian Bolshevism, Jewish Bolshevism. So at that point, so this was what makes it inevitable? And the other question that historians deal with, does a person make the times, or do the times make the person? And historians debate that to some degree. They say, no, it has to be the person makes the times, but in the Hitler's case, the times made the person. So, but that's for you to decide after 6 minutes over, sorry.
who want to stay for a little bit, we can do that.
Thank you.
Wait a
No.
minute, wait.
Thank you. I can't help but wonder the similarities between, everybody knows what I'm talking about, the similarities between what went on in the 30s in Germany and what we have now, the marking of immigrants as rapists, and now today he's calling all Democrats evil. All the executive orders, the taking over the judiciary, the taking over the Congress. Do you see any similarities?
Go ahead, I have another question.
No, wait.
Good.
I have described the rise of Hitler and the tactics that he used. If you see similarities, okay. But I promised that I would not talk about U.S. politics. I would just talk about German politics.
During the years that you were describing his rise to power, his support was also coming from America. There were camps on Long Island, youth camps, Nazi youth camps. And of course, Lindenberg, Ford, and people in the government supporting his rise to power. Can you speak about America's position at those years, during those years, even though they supposedly won the war against Germany, right? Oh, go ahead.
If you have an opportunity to check out a book by Rachel Maddow called Recall,
Rachel Maddow?
yeah, where she talks about what went on. Germany, Hitler made a major attempt to keep the United States out of the war. I taught a course on neo-fascism, and I did part of it about the Nazis in the United States during the 1930s. There were 2 attempted coups on the American government against Roosevelt. One early on in his presidency and one later on. And she documents it all. There was marches down Fifth Avenue of the Moon, the American Moon.
American.
Nazis.
The Madison Square Garden, the meeting there.
Yeah. 24,000 people.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and I ran into this in World War I too, with many young men of German descent went to Germany during World War I to fight for the Germans. And in World War II, the same thing happened. Not as many, but the same thing happened. And Hitler and his agents here spent a lot of money trying to affect our politics to keep us out of the war. And it actually worked. Roosevelt wanted to stop Hitler, but he didn't have the votes to do it until Japan attacked us. And that did it.
How much do you think Mussolini and Italy's form of fascism encouraged Hitler, or made it easier for Hitler to follow that pattern and then go his own German way?
Yeah, well, Mussolini's march was in 1922. And what was happening in Italy was a real serious uprising of communists and anarchists in particular in the industrial cities. And they were going after the king because the king blamed the king for defeat in North Africa. So the march on Rome was theater. They're all dressed up. They got pictures of them, marching along. And they get there, and the king says to Mussolini, "Okay, you're the prime minister." There was no violence. There was his black shirt said gun violence, and in that thing it was easy, slam dunk. Hitler had to wait 10 more years, but he did copy Mussolini, and they met Mussolini had some doubts about the ability to win when they did form the Axis powers. And Mussolini was eventually removed from office by the king and ended up hanging upside down with his mistress in flagpole in Vienna, no, in Milan, I think. More questions? But Mussolini was a big influence on Hitler.
Thank you, Joe.
What question?
Another question, I recall reading about how he developed his speaking technique. That he started out in a small beer house.
Hitler speaking